We've all got that friend who seems to just get people right. They always know what to say, how to navigate things. It feels like pure intuition. But what if that ability, that knack for reading people, wasn't some kind of mysterious sixth sense? What if it was actually a set of skills you could learn? That's what we're diving into today, the methods, the models that go beyond just gut feelings, to help you really understand emotions, thoughts, intentions, behaviors, all of it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And our mission here in this deep dive is really to give you actionable insights, things pulled from some pretty fascinating research that you can, apply right away in your daily life, whether it's figuring out why a colleague seems hesitant or deciphering a loved one's mood, or just navigating the general complexities of interacting with people. We want to give you a bit of an edge.
Yeah, an advantage. And really, at the heart of understanding anyone is figuring out what truly makes them tick, isn't it? What are the fundamental drivers behind what they do? Okay, let's unpack this. Starting with, motivation. That seems core.
It really is. At a very, very basic level, human motivation often boils down to the pleasure-pain principle. Fundamentally, we're kind of wired to move towards things we think will feel good or bring pleasure, and move away from things we think will cause us pain. Now, that might sound overly simple, but it has some really profound implications for behavior.
Okay, think about this analogy. Imagine you stumble across a massive chest, overflowing with gold, just sitting there in the desert. Instant pleasure, right? You'd be thrilled. But then you hear this huge rumble, look up and see a truck speeding right towards you. Suddenly, that gold, not the priority anymore.
Not at all.
You're laser focused on avoiding the very real, very immediate pain of getting hit. That threat just completely overrides the potential pleasure. And what's striking is how often that fear of a potential negative outweighs the pull of a positive.
Precisely. And this plays out all the time in ways we might not even consciously register. Consider someone who's really struggling with a craving, let's say for a cigarette. Logically, they know the long-term health risks, the cost, all of that. But the immediate discomfort, the sort of pain of resisting that urge right now, that often turns out to be the stronger motivator in that specific moment.
So immediate emotional needs can just trump long-term logic.
Yeah, it really highlights that.
So if we can get a handle on what someone genuinely sees as a reward and what they're actively trying to avoid, even if it's just from their own internal perspective, that's a massive clue, a clue to understanding why they do what they do. And it even gives us insight into how we might, influence things. Like, think about a kid who just refuses point blank to clean their room. That's a painful task for them.
Right.
But if you frame it differently, maybe make it a game, promise a clear reward afterwards, suddenly the motivation shifts. The pain seems less, the pleasure is boosted.
Exactly. You're changing their perception of the pleasure-pain balance for that task. And while pleasure and pain are like powerful initial drivers, the whole picture of human motivation is, more complex. That's where something like Maslow's hierarchy of needs comes into play. This model suggests our motivations work in layers, sort of like a pyramid. At the very bottom, you've got our basic physiological needs: air, food, water, sleep, survival stuff.
Okay.
Once those are relatively met, we start focusing on safety and security, feeling safe, stable. Then comes the need for love and belonging, connection, relationships, acceptance. After that, it's self-esteem, feeling competent, getting recognition. And finally, right at the top is self-actualization, that drive to fulfill our potential, be all we can be.
So depending on where someone kind of is on that pyramid, their main focus shifts dramatically. A baby, for instance, is almost totally driven by those bottom-level survival needs: food, comfort, safety.
Right, absolutely.
But as we grow, our focus broadens. We start wanting to connect, to fit in, feel valued. And for some people, maybe later in life, the main driver becomes about, leaving a legacy or achieving personal fulfillment.
Precisely. Someone who's genuinely worried about where their next meal is coming from.
Yeah.
They're not going to be primarily motivated by, say, abstract concerns about their self-esteem at that moment. Their energy, their focus, it's all going towards meeting those fundamental foundational needs first.
Right.
So understanding this hierarchy can help us make sense of behavior that might seem baffling otherwise. It helps us see the unmet needs that are really pushing someone.
Okay, now here's where things get really interesting, I think. Because even when we understand these basic drives, pleasure, pain, Maslow's needs people don't always act, rationally or straightforwardly. That's where these unconscious ego protection things come in, right? Defense mechanisms.
Yes, exactly. Defense mechanisms are like the mind's automatic defense system. They kick in to protect us from emotional distress, from feelings of anxiety, inadequacy, threat. And they operate largely outside of our conscious awareness, kind of shielding our ego. But the fascinating and sometimes tricky thing is, while they offer short-term comfort, they can also distort how we see reality.
Okay, so give me an example. Like, if someone gets a bad review at work, instead of thinking, okay, I need to improve, they might just convince themselves, my boss just hates me. Is that denial? Just refusing to accept the reality of the feedback.
That's a perfect example of denial. Minimizing it, refusing to accept it. And then there's rationalization. That's where we cook up these seemingly logical but actually false reasons to justify our behavior or our failures. Think of Aesop's fable. The fox who couldn't reach the grapes.
Yeah, so he says they were probably sour anyway.
Exactly. He changed the narrative to protect his ego because he failed. We do that all the time with flimsy excuses.
And projection, that's when we take our own feelings or traits, usually ones we don't like in ourselves, and we sort of stick them onto other people. So someone feeling really insecure might constantly call other people incompetent or stupid.
That's projection. It's like they're offloading their own unwanted feelings onto someone else. It's easier to criticize it out there than acknowledge it in here. And interestingly, research actually backs this up. People who are highly critical of certain traits in others often score higher on measures of those same traits themselves.
Wow. Like seeing your own reflection but blaming the mirror?
Kind of, yeah. And there are others too. Repression, for example, unconsciously blocking out painful or traumatic memories, like forgetting childhood abuse. Reaction formation is another one, behaving in the exact opposite way to how you truly feel.
Like someone deeply insecure acting super arrogant and aggressive.
Precisely. Overcompensating. Then there's regression, acting childish when stressed. Sublimation is channeling unacceptable impulses into something socially okay, even admired.
Like channeling aggressive energy into competitive sports.
Exactly. Or maybe channeling loneliness into intense charity work. And displacement, taking out your frustration on a safe target instead of the real source. Yelling at your partner after a bad day at work.
It's actually kind of startling when you think about how often these might be operating, not just in other people, but in ourselves too, probably.
Oh, absolutely.
And recognizing that someone might be, say, projecting their insecurities or denying a problem, it gives you a much deeper insight into what's really going on beneath the surface.
It points towards their hidden vulnerabilities, their unmet needs, their fears.
Okay, so we've got motivation, defense mechanisms, these internal drivers.
Absolutely. Now let's shift focus a bit.
Yeah.
From those internal states to how we communicate outwardly, often without even saying a word.
Yeah.
Nonverbal communication. It's a huge part of reading people, and a lot of it is deeply ingrained, biological, evolutionary.
And the face is such a massive billboard for emotions, isn't it? Those really quick, fleeting expressions, microexpressions.
Yes, microexpressions. They're super brief, involuntary facial movements that can flash across the face. And they can reveal emotions someone might be trying to hide. What's really fascinating is the research suggesting these are pretty much universal across cultures.
Really? Like what?
Well, think of happiness. A genuine smile, what scientists call a Duchenne smile, involves crinkling around the eyes, not just the mouth.
Ah, okay.
Sadness might show up as a slight drooping of the eyelids, the corners of the lips turning down slightly. Disgust often involves wrinkling the nose, maybe raising the upper lip.
Okay.
Anger can look like lowered, tense eyebrows, maybe tightened, narrowed eyes. Fear often shows with raised eyebrows and eyelids, maybe the mouth stretched tight horizontally. And surprise usually involves raised, rounded eyebrows, wide eyes.
But you have to be careful, right? You can't just see one little flicker and assume everything.
Absolutely crucial point. You cannot interpret these in isolation. Seeing a brief frown doesn't automatically mean deep sadness. Context is everything.
Right. It's like trying to read a word by just seeing one letter. You need more. What about those other little things people do, like fiddling with stuff, touching their face, pacifying behaviors?
Exactly. Pacifying behaviors. These are those unconscious little gestures we often do to self-soothe, to comfort ourselves when we feel stressed, anxious, uncomfortable, or maybe perceive a threat.
Like what sort of things?
Oh, common ones include touching the neck or throat area, rubbing the forehead, playing with hair, wringing hands, even things like adjusting a collar or tie, sort of ventilating. These can all be attempts to calm ourselves down.
But again, context matters hugely here too, I assume.
Absolutely. Someone touching their neck during a really tense negotiation, that might signal discomfort or feeling threatened. But someone touching their neck while they're deep in thought, concentrating hard, could just be an absent-minded habit, or even an itch.
So you can't just make a checklist.
No, definitely not. The key is always to look for clusters. Do multiple signals point in the same direction? And how does it fit the situation?
And it's not just the face and hands, right? Our whole body posture, how we move, that says a lot too.
Oh, absolutely. Our bodies are constantly communicating. Leaning slightly towards someone usually signals interest, engagement. You're moving into their space. Leaning away or crossing your arms firmly often suggests the opposite: discomfort, maybe defensiveness, disagreement.
Okay.
Wide open gestures, taking up space. That often signals confidence, feeling comfortable.
Yeah.
Whereas a slumped posture, looking down, might convey feelings of defeat, low energy, submission.
What about smaller things, like feet? I've heard about happy feet.
Yeah, that little bouncing or tapping of the feet, it can genuinely indicate positive feelings, excitement, maybe even impatience to get going on something good.
Yeah.
And conversely, if someone's feet are consistently angled towards the door, towards an exit, that's often a pretty strong subconscious signal that they want to leave. They're mentally heading for the door.
That's fascinating. Even crossed legs.
Even crossed legs can offer clues. Sometimes it's just comfort, but other times it could be a subtle barrier, a sign of feeling defensive or needing protection. Or sometimes people might subtly angle their crossed legs towards someone they prefer or feel more aligned with in a group.
So the big picture here is really about looking for patterns, for consistency across all these different channels: face, hands, body, maybe even tone of voice, not getting hung up on one single gesture.
Precisely. That's the crucial thing. You're looking for clusters of cues. When the microexpression matches the body language, and that aligns with the verbal message and the tone of voice, that unified message gives you a much more reliable, a much more accurate reading of someone's actual emotional state and maybe their underlying intentions.
And can we often group these overall nonverbal patterns into broader categories? Like, you can sometimes just get a feeling that someone is being aggressive or maybe submissive just from their body language?
Yes, definitely. We can often perceive these broad behavioral messages nonverbally. Aggressive behavior often involves more confrontational cues, maybe leaning too far forward, invading space, using sharp or forceful gestures. Assertiveness, on the other hand, tends to look more balanced. Open posture, direct but not intimidating eye contact, firm but controlled movements.
Okay.
Submissiveness often involves those lowering gestures, trying to seem smaller, taking up less space, maybe avoiding eye contact, a softer voice. Relaxation usually looks open, loose, maybe mirroring the posture of the person they're talking to. And deception, well, we'll get into that more, but it often creates a sense of underlying tension, anxiety, maybe more closed-off body language, some incongruence.
Okay, this is building into a really useful toolkit. We've got motivation, we've got nonverbals. Now, how does personality science fit into this? Does understanding someone's general personality type help us read them better in specific moments?
Absolutely. Personality, you can think of it as someone's typical, relatively stable pattern of behaving, thinking, and feeling over time. Knowing someone's general disposition, their usual tendencies, provides a really valuable backdrop or framework for interpreting their more immediate reactions and actions.
Right, like the big five personality traits. That's a common one. Ocean.
Exactly. The Ocean model: openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism.
So openness is about curiosity, imagination.
Openness to experience, likes novelty, variety, intellectually curious. Conscientiousness relates to being organized, responsible, dependable, disciplined, goal-oriented. And interestingly, conscientiousness often predicts long-term success in life, work, health, relationships, sometimes even better than raw intelligence does.
Wow. Okay, extroversion is about being outgoing, sociable.
Yeah, energized by social interaction. Agreeableness reflects being cooperative, trusting, empathetic, kind, prioritizing harmony. And neuroticism indicates a tendency towards experiencing negative emotions like anxiety, sadness, irritability, emotional instability.
So knowing roughly where someone falls on these five dimensions gives you a sense of their general behavioral landscape.
Exactly. Someone high in agreeableness, for example, is probably more likely to try and smooth over conflict in a group. Someone high in conscientiousness will likely follow through on commitments.
Then there are other models too, like the Myers-Briggs type indicator, the MBTI, that uses different categories.
Yes, the MBTI looks at preferences along 4 dichotomies. First, where you direct your energy: introversion energy from within, or extroversion energy from external interaction. Second, how you prefer to take in information: sensing focusing on concrete facts, details, the present reality, or intuition focusing on patterns, possibilities, future implications.
Okay.
Third, how you prefer to make decisions: thinking using logic, objective analysis, or feeling considering values, impact on people. And fourth, how you prefer to live your outer life: judging preferring structure, planning, closure, or Perceiving prefer flexibility, spontaneity, keeping options open.
So an extrovert might dominate a group discussion, while an introvert needs quiet time after.
Could be, yeah. Or a sensing type might want all the specific facts before deciding, while an intuitive type looks at the big picture possibilities.
And there are also the Kiersey temperaments, which group types that share underlying preferences from things like the MBTI.
That's right. Kiersey groups them into 4 temperaments based on core values and communication styles. You have guardians, SJ types in MBTI, dependable, practical, value, tradition, security. Artisans, SP types, adaptable, action-oriented, value, freedom, spontaneity. Idealists, NF types, empathetic, insightful, value, meaning, personal growth, authenticity. And rationals, NT types, logical, strategic, value, competence, knowledge.
And one more, the Enneagram. That focuses more on core fears and desires, right? 9 types.
Yes, the Enneagram is a fascinating model that delves into deeper motivations. Each of the 9 types is seen as driven by a core fear and a corresponding core desire. For example, the type 1, often called the perfectionist or reformer, has a core desire for integrity and balance, and a core fear of being corrupt or evil. The type 2, the helper, desires to be loved and appreciated, and fears being unwanted or unworthy of love. The type 3, the achiever, desires to be valuable and worthwhile, fearing being worthless, and so on for all 9 types.
So all these frameworks, Big 5, MBTI, Kiersey, Enneagram, they offer different lenses.
Exactly. Different lenses for understanding the underlying patterns and tendencies that shape someone's behavior. But, and this is really crucial, they are just models, frameworks. They shouldn't be used to rigidly pigeonhole people. Humans are complex.
Right, not putting people in boxes.
No. The real value comes from using these ideas as a general guide. Considering someone's typical personality patterns can help you better interpret their behavior in the moment, especially when it deviates from their norm.
Okay, that makes sense. So, we're building this more nuanced picture. Now, let's tackle something a lot of people are really curious about. Lie detection. Can we really learn to spot when someone's not being truthful?
The million-dollar question. And the first thing to say is, well, most people are actually not very good at detecting lies based solely on, like, stereotypical tells.
Like avoiding eye contact or fidgeting.
Exactly. Those things we often think are signs of lying. Research shows they're not reliable indicators on their own. Liars don't necessarily do those things more than truth tellers, especially if they're practiced or not feeling much guilt. Effective lie detection, or maybe it's better to say detecting deception, tends to rely more on analyzing the conversation itself, the interaction, looking for inconsistencies in the story.
So it's less about finding one single Pinocchio's nose sign, and more about paying attention to the whole interaction, how the story hangs together.
Precisely. A really useful strategy is often to start with open-ended questions. Just ask broad questions and let the person talk freely. Don't interrupt too much at first. This gives them more rope, so to speak, more opportunity to maybe contradict themselves or reveal inconsistencies if their story isn't true.
Okay.
And it can also be beneficial to withhold information you might already have, at least initially. If they don't know what you know, that uncertainty can sometimes pressure them into accidentally revealing something truthful while trying to manage their lie.
Like that example you mentioned earlier, if you suspect your spouse met someone for dinner, but you know that person was out of town, asking an open, "How was your evening?" might lead them into a story that doesn't add up.
Exactly. You let them construct the narrative first.
And what about analyzing the story itself? Are there specific things to listen for?
Yeah, there are a few things researchers look at. Sometimes people who are being deceptive might avoid making spontaneous self-corrections in their story. Truthful accounts often have little, "Oh, wait, actually it was," moments. They might also provide an excessive amount of irrelevant detail, almost too much information.
Trying too hard to sound convincing. Or buying time.
Could be either or both. You might also notice stalling tactics asking you to repeat the question unnecessarily, long pauses before answering simple things. And sometimes there's just a noticeable disconnect. The emotions they're expressing or not expressing don't seem to quite match the content of the story they're telling.
You also mentioned increasing cognitive load as a tool, making it harder for them to lie. How does that work?
Right. So lying generally requires more mental effort than telling the truth. You have to invent the lie, remember it, keep it consistent, monitor the listener's reaction, suppress the truth. It's taxing. So by asking unexpected questions or more complex questions, you increase that cognitive load. You make their brain work harder. This can make it more difficult for them to maintain the lie effectively. Inconsistencies might slip out, or their responses might become strained, delayed, or show unusual emotional reactions, or maybe a lack of expected emotion.
Can you give an example?
Sure, asking someone to recount an event in reverse chronological order is a classic technique. It's much harder to do if you're making it up. Or asking very specific, unexpected sensory details. Or asking about their emotional reaction to something they claim to have witnessed. Imagine asking someone who's lying about discovering something shocking, like a staged crime scene. How did you feel in that exact moment you saw it? Their description of the feeling might seem rehearsed, hollow, or oddly detached if it wasn't real.
Okay, I see. And while we shouldn't rely heavily on single nonverbal cues, are there any general physical tendencies sometimes associated with deception?
Well, some studies have noted potential indicators, but again, massive caveats apply. Things like an increase in blink rate, or more speech disturbances, more ums, stutters, sentence fragments have sometimes been observed. But, and I really have to stress this, these are not definitive signs of lying. Nerves alone can cause all of these things.
So the baseline is critical.
Absolutely critical. You need to establish what's normal for that individual in that context. How do they normally talk? How do they normally gesture? Then you look for significant deviations from that baseline, especially in response to specific key questions or shifts in the topic. That's where potential flags might appear.
You also touched on thin slicing earlier, those quick intuitive judgments. How does that fit in? Can we trust our gut feeling?
Yeah, thin slicing is fascinating. It refers to our ability to make surprisingly accurate judgments about people based on very brief exposure, sometimes just seconds of observation. There's a real interplay between that intuitive gut feeling and the more deliberate, conscious analysis we've been discussing. Researchers like John Gottman's, for instance, showed they could predict with remarkable accuracy whether a married couple would divorce just by watching them interact for a few minutes, picking up on subtle negative cues.
Wow.
So that intuitive sense can be powerful, but it's usually most reliable when it's combined with and checked against the more analytical approach, looking for those patterns, those clusters of cues we talked about. Don't ignore your gut, but don't rely on it exclusively either.
This is all incredibly insightful. We've covered so much about reading the person directly, their motivations, their body language, their words. But can we also learn things about people indirectly by observing their extended self? You know, their environment, their stuff, their online life.
Oh, absolutely. People leave traces of themselves everywhere, often without realizing it. Think about their word choices alone. How often do they use I versus we? That can hint at self-focus versus group orientation. The emotional intensity of their language, are they using strong, vivid words or more neutral, detached ones? That signals their current state. Do they use a lot of jargon? That might suggest expertise or maybe an attempt to impress or exclude. Even the complexity of their vocabulary offers clues about background, education.
What about visual things, like photos they display or share online?
Yeah, even photos can be revealing. We mentioned the Duchenne smile, the genuine eye-crinkling one versus a more forced or social smile. That tells you something about the emotion behind it, and why you had to be super careful not to make huge leaps or stereotype someone's overall physical appearance, their grooming habits. It can sometimes offer hints about their self-esteem, their attention to detail, their priorities. How much effort do they put in?
And clothing, that's a big one, surely. I guess it's like a very deliberate form of communication.
Absolutely. Clothing is loaded with signals. It can communicate identity. I'm a professional. I'm an artist. I belong to this subculture. It can signal values, perceived socioeconomic status, even cultural or religious affiliation. You look at the effort involved, any obvious status markers, how appropriate it is for the setting. It tells a story about how they see themselves and how they want to be seen.
And our physical spaces, our homes, our desks at work, even our cars.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Our personal environments are often seen by researchers as extensions of personality. They reflect us, for instance, how someone decorates the outside of their home might hint at their level of sociability or desire for connection with neighbors. The level of neatness and organization inside often correlates with conscientiousness. Are things tidy and ordered or messy and chaotic? And the types of objects people choose to display, books, art, photos, awards, collections, these often reflect their values, their interests, their personal history, even how they regulate their emotions. Do they surround themselves with calming things or stimulating things? There was even that interesting study suggesting you could make surprisingly accurate guesses about someone's political leanings just by looking at their bedroom decor.
Wow. Okay. And what about online, our digital footprint, email habits, social media?
Yeah, even that can offer glimpses. Email timestamps, for example, might give clues about someone's chronotype. Are they an early bird or a night owl? Some studies link that to certain personality traits. And social media profiles. Well, research suggests that while people curate their image, their profiles often do reflect their actual personality traits to some extent. Certain Big Five traits like extroversion and openness seem to be more detectable online than others.
But you have to be cautious, right? It's still a curated version.
Absolutely. It's just a thin slice, as we said before. It's data, but it's incomplete data. You have to integrate it with everything else.
And those really quick first impressions, like just shaking someone's hand.
Even something that simple can communicate quite a bit, surprisingly. A firm handshake is often read, rightly or wrongly, as a sign of confidence, extroversion. A weaker, maybe quicker handshake might be interpreted as shyness, reluctance, perhaps lower assertiveness. It sets an initial tone.
Okay. Now, you also mentioned earlier that sometimes asking indirect questions can be more revealing than asking direct ones, especially about deeper values or motivations. Can you give us some examples of what that looks like?
Absolutely. Indirect questions can often bypass someone's conscious filters or social desirability bias. They get at the underlying truth more effectively sometimes. So instead of asking directly, are you motivated by money or status, you could ask something like, if there were two prizes you could win, one offering public recognition and one offering a quiet, significant financial reward, which would you work harder to achieve and why? Their reasoning reveals their true driver. Or instead of what's important to you, maybe ask, where do you find it easy to spend your money freely? And where do you tend to really save or skimp? That often highlights their real priorities, experiences versus things, comfort versus status, etc.
What else?
Asking about their greatest achievement often reveals the qualities they value most in themselves, what makes them feel proud. Asking, what kinds of tasks or activities feel almost effortless for you, and which ones consistently leave you feeling drained? That points to natural inclinations and strengths versus areas of struggle.
That's a good one.
Even asking, what positive traits do you most commonly notice or admire in other people? This can sometimes subtly reveal traits they value or see in themselves or wish they had. It's a form of projection, but in a positive sense. Or try. If you were given a large sum of money to donate to charity, would you give it to one cause or spread it among many? And what kind of cause would feel most compelling? That reveals broader values, priorities, a more abstract one. If you could be any animal, what would you be and why? People often choose animals whose traits they admire or identify with. It's metaphorical self-perception.
Okay.
Asking about their favorite movie or book and why it resonates with them can reveal a lot about their worldview, their moral compass, the narratives they're drawn to, a high-pressure hypothetical. If your house was on fire and you could only save one thing, assuming all people and pets are safe, what would it be? That gets at fundamental values, what's truly irreplaceable. And finally, asking about their greatest fear can reveal deep vulnerabilities in how they perceive threats in the world or within themselves.
Wow, those are really thought-provoking. So instead of a direct, potentially blunt question that might get a guarded answer, you're sort of opening a side door, letting them reveal their inner world more organically.
Exactly. Indirect questions often feel less confrontational, less like an interrogation. They tap into deeper truths, values, fears, and desires without necessarily triggering the same defensiveness or need to give the right answer. You end up with a much richer, more nuanced understanding of what really makes that person tick.
So as we wrap this up, it's just incredibly clear that reading people isn't one simple thing. It's this really multifaceted skill. It's not about finding one magic trick or relying on a single cue.
That's exactly right. It involves weaving together observations from all these different areas, paying attention to their underlying motivations, the pleasure-pain drivers, the deeper needs, being really attuned to their nonverbal communication, the face, the body, the gestures, the posture, recognizing their general personality tendencies, their typical patterns, listening carefully not just to what they say, but how they say it, their word choices, their tone, and even observing the environment they create around themselves, their belongings, their spaces, their digital presence. It all adds to the picture.
And the really crucial takeaways seem to be always consider the context. Establish that baseline for what's normal for that person. Look for consistent patterns, clusters of signals rather than isolated incidents, and try really hard to avoid jumping to quick conclusions based on just one piece of information.
Precisely. It's about becoming a more deliberate, more conscious observer. actively engaging with these ideas in your everyday interactions and, continually sharpening your ability to notice and interpret what's going on with the people around you.
Okay, so now that you're armed with all these tools and perspectives, here's a final thought for you to chew on. How might your own underlying motivations, your own defense mechanisms, your perhaps unconscious biases, how might those be influencing how you are being perceived and read by other people? What message are you unintentionally sending out into the world? It's kind of a fascinating mirror to hold up to ourselves, isn't it?